Okay, let's take a look at the new Advanced Motion Blur in HDR Light Studio. So we've got VRED with this spacecraft scene open, and we've got a composite light, and I've basically got a HDRI map, and then I've repeated some parts of it to kind of make sure there's a lot of these little lights going on in the map, and this is all going to get motion blurred. So if we come up to the composite and then we go to the filter settings, you'll see that the advanced motion blur is a totally different filter, separate to the standard first motion blur that we released. So if we select motion blur advanced, and then we can see that that motion blur has taken effect. And I'll turn on this light here, which creates a really nice color scheme for the lighting. So the first thing that we need to do is get the direction right for the motion blur. So if we select the composite light, we come to the canvas, pick the motion blur for the light paint tool, and if we click here on the map, we can change that direction. So if we look at this spaceship, we can now see that that motion blur is heading in the right direction. Let's have a look at the settings over here. So we've got the U direction and the V direction, which we just set via the canvas, or we could adjust these by clicking here on the sliders. Then we have the blur length. So if we make that a smaller value, it all gets squished up. Now, this filter is quite computationally expensive, so it is slower than the other motion blur. So unless you want to use some of the more advanced effects that this has to offer, it would be faster to use the other motion blur with totally separate settings. So if I set the motion blur direction to be over here, change that blur length, you can see that it is a faster algorithm basically for this motion blur. But we'll go back to the motion blur advanced, which is doing a lot more. Okay, so we can see that this line is very jittery, and this is because we have a noise profile. So let's first look at the noise profile on this. So if I press the edit button, we have a noise profile editor panel, and we can scale this panel so we get a really good view of the path of the noise that's going to be applied to our motion path. So if we change the amplitude, this bottom setting, this is basically scaling that. Now as we change settings in this panel, they won't update straight away on the HDRI map. To view the changes, we press the apply button. There we go, and then we can see the change. So let's take down that amplitude, press apply, take down the amplitude, press apply. So you can see there's a more subtle effect there. Let's look at the other settings. So I'll raise the amplitude again. So we have spread. So this motion path has a certain amount of resolution, a number of steps within it that the noise is going to be shown against. So if I take this up really high, we are having a lot more noise that's all closer together. If I bring it to a low value, you can see the spread is almost like how many times this noise is kind of repeating, the frequency basically of this noise. Now at higher values, you will see that due to the resolution we have of the steps in the motion blur, that we get a more jagged result. So if I apply that, you can see this more jagged effect. And if I use lower values, because then you've got the same amount of points on the motion path, we can get something which is much smoother. So if I apply that, we have a smoother result. So you can play with this to really control that kind of the frequency of noise going down that motion. The next one is the seed. Now, the seed inputs into the noise algorithm, and really you can play with this just to change what this looks like from an artistic point of view. And we need the seed value so that the next time we open this project, the noise will look the same as when we were in this session. So the seed value inputs into the noise equation and lets you control the appearance and the type of effect that you get. So it's really nice to just play with this until you get a kind of jitter, a kind of noise that you're happy with. So we'll apply that. There we go. And the useful thing is that we can scale this panel to be really big, so we get a really nice visual of that noise. The final setting is the ground clamp. So this will clamp it so that we only get positive values. And this can be handy if you're trying to create an effect of, say, road noise, where there'll be less movement underneath than on the top. So if I apply that, this helps replicate a kind of a road noise effect. And by default, that is off. There we go. Now, if we were to press cancel, it would ignore any changes we've made when we have edited in this particular session. And if we press OK, it will apply the noise and it will close this panel. So if I press OK, nothing will change because we'd already applied that. So if we now look at our spaceship here, we've got that noise going off. And if we change the blur length and increase that, that noise will be stretched over the length. And you can create some quite cool effects. So if we go full screen with this now, you can see this nice jittery noise. And if we render this live into VRED at a high resolution, great, and we'll look at this at full screen again. So we can see the lovely detail and quality we've got on this motion path. Which creates a really nice effect. Okay, so we've covered the noise profile. Let's have a look at the curvature and the tilt setting. So if you were going around a corner, the motion blur would not be linear. So I would just edit the noise profile and make the amplitude 0, and I'll OK that, so we end up with a straight path, which will help to see what we're doing here. And the curvature will curve the path. So if we zoom out a bit, it might be easier to see what's happening. So if I put some curvature value onto this, you'll see that the path is curving and it's creating a curved effect. So this side of the HDRI map, actually the length of the motion blur is longer than on this side. And in terms of the direction we're heading in, if I go back to 0 curvature, you'll see we're heading in this direction here, but as soon as we start curving the path, that will start moving along because we're now going round a corner. And there's not quite enough detail to see this on the floor. Let's have a little, we increase that. So this side, the streaks will be shorter. And you can see the effect that we look like we're going around a corner, because that would make this side stretch out and this side get more close together. So, and you can see on the floor actually now, you can see that curvature in the map and the details on the map on the floor. Now, what can be quite useful is to load a dot pattern, or even just actually put some lights on the floor. So if I just put a light on the floor, make it quite small, and quite bright, smaller than that. So bring it down towards the lower part of the map, duplicate that, put another one here, duplicate, put another one here, duplicate, great, and then go back to the composite, and you'll see that as we put in larger values for the curvature, that all starts to curve. And then if we bring that back to straight with a value of 0, it's going straight. So it just lets you create that effect of going around a corner. Now, the tilt effectively is the direction. So 0 takes you to the left, 90 would take you upwards. So there's a curve in the up direction, and you can see the direction you're heading in starts to move up. If I increase that, it goes further up. And then if we do 180, that will take you to the right. So now that's curving to the right. And if we do 270, that will curve you downwards. So you can see that curve going down now. So if you're doing this to edit a HDRI map that is lighting a shot and you have a backplate image, then the difference that the curvature will make will be subtle, but it may be enough that you can see in your reflections, and it gives you that more accuracy basically. So that's the curvature setting. So we'll put that back to 0 and the tilt value to 0, although it doesn't make any difference because there's no curvature. Okay, and then we'll edit the noise and put a bit of amplitude back in. There we go. Now, the final feature is the depth image. So we'll use a different setup for this example. Okay, so I've created a new light look. I've got a composite light, and in here I've got a HDRI map that I want to work with, and then I've loaded a dot pattern on top of this, which acts as a bit of a guide to help me see what I'm doing with this motion blur. So we come up and we've got the motion blur advanced applied. So we want to set the direction for this blur, and we really want these red lines to flow with the curve of the road at this point. Now this road is going to curve, if I turn that off, it actually curves around here, comes around here, then curves the other way. But at the point where we are, where the shot's been taken, we want the curve here. It's not going to be a compound curve, it's only curving in one direction, and we want it to curve around here. So if we turn on the motion blur advanced I'm going to take off any noise by changing the amplitude to 0. And I'm going to play with the U direction first to try and get it lining up a little bit. We can see how those dots are stretching to follow this curve here. And here you can see that they are not, they're following here, but they're not here and here, and that's because the road's got some curvature. So if I just start to increase the curvature value, you can see now that those lines are parallel by using this dot guide basically. So that looks right. That's following about the right direction really. That's accurate enough. So I can come into the composite light and turn off that dot pattern image I loaded and go back, and then we can change the blur length. And the way it's mapping onto this dome isn't particularly accurate or set up right. I'm really just wanting to show how this feature works in terms of the depth image. So what we did is we painted an image that we're going to load. So if I come here, open this image and just look at this quite large. So here is a mask image, and where it's white, the blur will be applied 100%. Where it's black, it will be not applied. There'll be the scaling of that motion blur will be 0. And then as we get into the grey areas, that will be, so if it was a 50% grey, you'll have a 50% scaling of the motion blur value. So it's basically scaling the motion blur per pixel from here. So if I open this image as my depth image, we can now see, and if I zoom in here for example, we can see that there's motion applied to the railing and the posts for that railing, but the sea has not been motion blurred, and the sign's been motion blurred, and the sun's not been motion blurred. Painting an image like that in Photoshop or another image editor is quite easy to do, and it gives you a lot of control over this motion blur. And then if I delete that image from this slot, now the whole image is getting that motion blur. So I'll just load that up again. That's my mask. So I'm going to load another example now. So here I've got this nighttime shot of this kind of urban environment, and we'll apply the motion blur advanced. And this time we're going to use the depth image to control which bits of this are going to get blurred. So I'll load in a mask, and we've basically just painted 3 light sources that we want to get blurred on this mask image. So I'll open that up. Great, so now you can see only where the mask, where we painted white on these particular lights, they're the only bits of this that are actually getting motion blurred now. So you can create these kind of light trail effects, so we can increase the length of that. We could then edit the noise. Edit the curve and the direction, pick that composite, pick motion blur from the light paint tool, and we can create these really nice light trail effects all inside this single filter. It looks kind of best if it's kind of in the middle of all the lights. Let's change the noise profile again. Okay. So you can create some funky effects using the depth image. So it can be used to replicate the amount of motion blur due to depth, or just to create interesting effects when you isolate certain areas like you have for this. So that concludes showing you the new advanced motion blur in the new version of HDR Light Studio. Thank you for watching.